Thank you so much, Sherry, and just a great pleasure to be with you. I have to say, I feel a little more ease today. I gave this talk last night at 5 o'clock, and I said yesterday that that was the first time I'd given this talk, and now this is the second time. So I'm now feeling very kind of at ease that I should be able to finish it on time, and hopefully the flow will go well. What's different about it is usually I focus in on either undergraduate medical education or graduate medical education. And this is one that kind of looks at issues across the medical education continuum. And I hope if there are people here from other professions that the lessons I'm going to talk about here that I think you can kind of pick up from this presentation are really resonate, are not distinct and kind of specific for medicine at all. So I always start with some kind of an introduction and framing thoughts, and I will do that here. Um, that are kind of key things as I look at this issue of well-being in medicine. Of course, there's been a big recognition that the people are struggling and that we need to be pushing to promote well-being. Um, and interestingly, I've struggled with this word well-being and really for a couple of reasons. One is, as I joined the ACGME and I was traveling around the country before the pandemic, especially from residents, but also from faculty and even medical students. I was getting pushback like, don't talk to me about well-being. It's not even possible. We're working too hard. We're underappreciated. We're mistreated, et cetera. And there was almost this kind of rejection of it. And I could understand that. And I guess the second piece that I think is a little problematic when well-being is the target is I think it's led to some well-intended and I think important interventions, that are focused on the individual, things like, mindfulness and meditation and yoga and social events. And those are all well and good. I wouldn't stop doing those, but they really aren't addressing the root causes of what is leading to distress. And so I started saying, do we need a different word? And the word I landed on, I don't know if it's ideal, is really satisfaction. If we focused more primarily on helping people become more satisfied with their work setting, with the school setting, so that they show up each day excited to be there, energized, positive, out of that, I think well-being could emerge. The other, which I'm not going to have a chance to talk about much today at all, but is another feature of my work, is I don't think we talk enough about how many individuals in medicine and healthcare overall struggle with satisfaction with self. There are a whole group of mindsets, maladaptive perfectionism, imposter syndrome, feelings of inadequacy, embarrassment, or shame that can add to the distress caused by the environment. So if we worked more on satisfaction with work and school and satisfaction with self, I think we'd be making more progress in achieving more well-being in the work setting. So that's number one. Second is there's a tendency when I look across the country that there's a lot of people trying different things that I kind of characterize as treatments of this problem, right? There might be coaching, there might be mentoring, there might be peer support, you name it. The people will try things. Um, I think what's, again, great that people are doing that, but I think sometimes we need to spend more time making a diagnosis, trying to figure out what is the problem within this learning environment that we need to work on to improve. And I think that there's a little bit in the well-being movement of this one size fits all, and I've heard this from people like CEOs and others that like, just tell me what to do. And I don't think we really can, because the fixes have to be responsive to the environments in which people are working. And even in one institution, what is going on in pediatrics and threats to well-being or satisfaction may be are likely to be vastly different than they are, say, in neurosurgery. And I would even argue within a pediatric department, the threats to well-being for those in, say, child development versus those who are working in the pediatric ICU, those jobs are completely different. And again, the threats to their well-being may be different. So I think we need to try to come up with solutions and interventions that are more responsive to the actual environment and cultures that people live in. And then that culture word. I think there's now, beyond the focus on individual resilience, which is never going to solve the problem. It's important, but never is going to be enough. There tends to be a lot of focus on what I would call systems when looking at the environment, kind of thinking of the workplace as a machine. So the result is, understandably, heavy focus on productivity pressures, documentation burden, administrative burden, frustrations with electronic health record, all of those things that can contribute to burnout, understandably. Um, and I would add to that, though, is some of those are going to be hard to fix. Some of them are going to be hard to improve. Productivity pressures, I mean, there's kind of an economic bottom line that people are compelled to meet. EHR, it feels like, maybe hopefully AI will do something there, but it seems like a lot of the changes have been incremental at best. And while we need to continue to focus on systems, I don't think we should be ignoring those. What I think has happened is that we don't focus enough on what just culture. What does it feel like to go to school in a certain place? What does it feel like to work in that setting? And that's something in kind of the third part of this talk that we'll really focus in on is what can we do to think about culture and improve culture? So those are the kind of framing thoughts. And what I'm going to talk next about is I really think it's helpful. There are a bunch of different models that you can use looking at well-being and improving workplace satisfaction. And one that I've kind of landed on is not one that I created, but it's actually an amalgam or a fusion of two other models. One by Maslach and Leiter, Christina Maslach and Al Leiter, who've done decades now of work in well-being and burnout specifically. Christina Maslach known for Maslach burnout inventory, but I don't think she receives enough attention for what she's done to explore the actual causes of burnout. And then to that, I add some factors from Daniel Pink book Drive, which is about motivation and keeping engaged, happy employees. So I'm going to run through this pretty briefly, and it's basically 6 domains that Maslach and Leiter came up with, and 2 more that I'll add from Daniel Pink. So this is Maslach and Leiter's. The first of the 6 domains is workload. And that's, again, as I said, what a lot of people focus on. And it's important to say it's not just the sheer amount of work, it's the nature of work. Is it repetitive? Is it inefficient? Are there barriers to it? Is it non-value added? Could it be done by someone with a lot less training? An important driver of burnout, but it's not the only one. Second one that they talk about is rewards. And when you think rewards, a lot of people move to, like find salary and benefits. And yeah, salary and benefits matter, but they are looking at this much more broadly in terms of rewards, really thinking about how much do people feel appreciated? How much do they feel valued? Before the pandemic, I think I visited something like 25 academic medical centers in about 18 months. And I don't think there was a single institution I visited where, especially the faculty, that they felt like incredibly appreciated and valued. So that's, I think, a real target, an area for improvement that we could be working on that doesn't have to be expensive. Community and connection. How much of a sense of belonging do you have? Do you enjoy the people you work with? Are there conditions set up that you can connect with each other and have time to have meaningful relationships? A really important thing about community and connection, we have to be very mindful of the fact that our experience of community and connection can be often profoundly, profoundly influenced by our identity. So there may be some who are in the majority who feel a great sense of community and connection, and others based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation may not feel that same sense of connection and community. So we have to be mindful when we're looking at this factor is how does identity impact our ability to feel that sense of connection or community? Autonomy. To me, the way I would put it is how much um, do you have a say in how the work is done? How much does your voice matter if it's heard at all when big decisions are made? This was another one, again, as I was traveling around the country before the pandemic and continue after the pandemic. Um, I think it's incredibly rare. The number of times faculty would tell me about big decisions being handed down from on high, often from the C-suite in the hospital or the medical practice, um, without any consultation, without any input. Um, and they were often not great decisions. And the second piece of pain that was associated with it wasn't a great decision, but the symbolic fact, like you didn't even care enough to get my input to ask what I thought would be a good solution, is I think a secondary hurt or hit that happens when you take away autonomy, and take away people's voices. Fifth one is fairness. Are people treated fairly? Is there a sense of civility within the organization? And this is one where I have to say, given kind of the historic inequities, unfairness in medicine and based on, race, ethnicity, gender, et cetera, I don't think this is a binary where you go, oh, are we fair or not? I think it's like the question is, how unfair are you? And how far do you have to move to get to a place of greater equity for all in your work environment? And then the last one is values. How much does your institution live up to the values that it espouses? And I have to tell a quick story. I didn't do this yesterday, but I'll add this in today, which is when I was traveling around, I often would ask people, employees, like, what's your marketing like campaign? What's the catchphrase that you use, for patients on billboards and things like that? And 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 then I follow up, like, is it been kind of changed in some ways that is rather cynical? And I think my favorite one is an institution, I don't have to name it, but in the Northeast, where their catchphrase, their marketing phrase was, amazing things are happening here. Amazing things are happening here. And the employees changed it to amazing, comma, things are happening here, which I just love. So what that really indicates is there was a gap between like the outward facing of who we are and what actually was going on, how the sausage was made. So those are the six drivers of either burnout or satisfaction. And I guess what I point out here, back to what I said about work, systems versus culture. I mean, workload is really the only one that's pretty much straight systems. The rest of these are all culture, and they're not receiving enough attention across the board, I think, in US in medicine and medical education. Okay, to that, I'll add Daniel Pink's. He just has two more that some of his overlap with Masek and Leiter, but the two that were unique is one that he terms mastery, and I'm not a fan of that word, but I use it here in honoring his work. It's basically a sense of competence. Are expectations clear? Is feedback given regularly, effectively, so that you can improve, but also feel good about your performance? I don't think we still pay enough attention to feedback. And I think what we should start to think of it as is not just something to improve in performance, but something that has a profound impact on workplace satisfaction and ultimately well-being as well. And the last one, of the kind of collective eight, then, is purpose or meaning, which I just think is so important, and we'll kind of touch on this later in my talk. Um, if you're in medicine and you don't have are not kind of fulfilled by a sense of purpose or meaning, I have to say you've kind of lost your way, and I say that without blame, because there is opportunity every day within your professional work to find purpose and meaning and to essentially be sustained by it. So something we'll dive into a little deeper later on. So those are the domains. I want to just talk briefly, very briefly, about a potential process then. You have the model and then the process. And I think what we need is kind of a different approach than what we're doing right now in well-being, which is um, in part kind of spurred by a research paradigm, which is like, let's start a program and see what the impact is. So let's start coaching, or let's start mentoring, or let's do, this or that, peer support, and measure burnout. And almost always with those kind of studies, what we find is, at best, modest improvements in burnout or improvement in well-being that are statistically significant, but ultimately not meaningful. And so what I think we need to instead is a much more iterative process, not just trying one thing at a time, but trying a number of things in this kind of continuous quality improvement kind of approach. Back to the idea of diagnosis, we have to have, I think, much more investment in making the diagnosis. And the process, I don't think, has to be expensive or labor intensive. I've been working on this kind of survey instrument that I'm calling an environmental scan that looks at those 8 domains that I already talked about. And just on a Likert scale, 1 to 5, how are we doing? How are we doing on community and connection? How are we doing on fairness? And I think the advantage of that kind of environmental scan is it's not a diagnostic instrument. It's kind of a screening tool to find out where are your strengths, where are your weakness. And it's really important, I think, to highlight the strengths, because sometimes I think there's so much of a tendency in medicine these days to just focus on what's wrong. And we forget, like, there's stuff that's right as well. So reminding people of those positives as we work on the negatives, I think is an opportunity with that kind of brief survey instrument. That's not enough. As I said, that's a screening instrument. The next then is to go deeper, a deeper dive through focus groups, department division meetings, one-on-one conversations. So if you find, for example, that there's a real problem with community and connection, you need to have conversations with people like, what's going on? Why do you feel that way? Let's get specifics about what's contributing to that global feeling that we're not, a lack of sense of community and connection. And importantly, in those conversations, that should then lead to interventions. Too often, I think interventions are implemented by well-meaning people who are not really necessarily deeply connected to people who are in the trenches doing the actual work. So that deep dive, I think, is vitally important. And then, of course, it's interventions, that are based on that kind of diagnostic process, and then follow-up assessments. Continue to track this. Does the environment seem to be improving? Does that correlate or produce improvements in well-being? So again, this doesn't have to be an incredibly elaborate or expensive process, but one that I think is just vitally important if we're going to kind of come up with more effective interventions to enhance well-being. So next segment is I'm going to talk about work that I led that Sherry alluded to at St. Louis University School of Medicine in terms of trying to improve their student mental health. So interestingly, and I'm going to try and tie this together a little better than I did yesterday, which is I didn't have that model that I just described. I was just kind of flying by the seat of my pants at that point. And after I describe the interventions, we'll return to that model and say, how well did it hit each of those kind of 8 domains in terms of this intervention? So back at St. Louis University, I joined the faculty and administration 2004 and as associate dean for curriculum. No background in well-being, no interest in well-being at that time. Around 2007, I was starting to read work that was coming largely out of Mayo Clinic, Lottie Derby, and others that were showing these kind of very high depression rates, high suicidality rates, high burnout rates in medical students, not just at Mayo, but at like 5 or 7 medical schools in the Midwest, mostly in Minnesota. And I'd been at St. Louis U for several years, and I looked at our students, and I'd had this approach of like engaging with students and listening and trying to make change and create this kind of nurturing, trusting environment. And when I looked at the students, then I was kind of like, it seemed inconceivable to me that large numbers of them were depressed or anxious. I knew individual students who struggled, certainly. But the idea that, like 28% or more might be depressed, or that 11% might be suicidal or something like that seemed completely implausible. And my supposition was like maybe just being nice and supportive to medical students was enough. And we did something that was really important, though, is we didn't trust that. We decided to survey the students to look at rates of depression and anxiety. And I have to say, I have to admit this, which I mostly did it to kind of demonstrate that like this was a way to like we'd had the answer at St. Louis University. And what became abundantly clear immediately was that we did not have the answer at all. So we had two baseline cohorts before we started the interventions. And this just shows their number. So we have an orientation end of year for first year medical students and end of year for second year medical students using a very well validated instrument that measured symptoms of depression. These were the findings. And generally, what most people would say with these screening tools is once you have moderate to higher, it's very likely pretty well correlated with actual depression. So you look at orientation, rates are quite low. And then at the end of the first year, they more than quadrupled, and then second year, even worse. Right. So these were the same kind of findings that Lottie Derby was finding at Mayo in her studies. Anxiety, even worse. Medical students start school with more anxiety than you might see in the general population early on. They're worried, what's med school going to be like? But it got much worse. So a majority of our students at the end of the first year and at the end of the second year, a majority of our students had significant symptoms of anxiety, and probably if they saw a therapist would be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. And so I will never forget when I got these results. I mean, when you look at results like this and the depression findings too, the only conclusion I think you can make is we were doing this to them. We were doing this to them. And as associate dean for curriculum, I was ultimately responsible. And so I said, like, this is not okay. Yeah, this is unacceptable. And we that day really started a push to say, what can we do about this? And the process, I'll just say briefly, was not only informed by these results. In that same survey, we had questions that said, like, what are the most stressful things in your experience? What are the things that are causing the most distress? And I'll just say the top three that we found in those surveys was the amount of information that we were teaching, the level of detail essentially that they had to master in the basic science courses or preclinical curriculum, the amount of time spent in class, and then competition for grades. Back then we had honors, near honors, pass, fail, and which a majority of schools were graded at that point. Only about 35% of schools didn't have grades in the first 2 years, and that's changed dramatically. So we started on this process, and it was kind of a simple model that I constructed at that point, which was really as follows: three components. One is that this was a largely an environmental problem, so let's lead with environmental changes. And it was essentially, what can we do to reduce unnecessary stressors or eliminate unnecessary stressors, and then enhance the learning environment? That was what we were going to start with. Second, though, is, being a doctor is stressful, med school is stressful, life is stressful. We thought that there are ways, evidence-based ways, that we could increase students' abilities to deal with stress, with a very modest well-being curriculum. And then third, that I kind of alluded to before, is I really felt like if we could help students find meaning in their work somehow, in their studies, that would be protective for mental health. So that was the model. And then basically here were the specific interventions. So in 2009, we switched to pass-fail grading in the first 2 years. We cut the curriculum by 10%, meaning every class had to give up 10% of their time. Concomitant with that was that we asked faculty and course directors to reduce their content by 10%, not just shove all of the same content into less time. That cut in class time resulted in the development of one full day every other week for elective activities and just time for themselves. And then we also kind of developed then these longitudinal electives and what we called kind of theme-based learning communities around things like research and service and well-being and international health, global health, that students were kind of self-organized and ran themselves. So that was kind of step one. The next year, we did this very modest resilience and mindfulness curriculum for our first year students that was largely focused on giving them skills to combat mindsets like imposter phenomenon and maladaptive perfectionism, and overcome feelings of kind of inadequacy, embarrassment, or shame that might be associated if with a performance that they wasn't up to their usual. Following year, we made changes to the human anatomy course. I think this is something we don't recognize enough in medical education and in education in general, the ability of one course to cause significant distress, even in a very supportive environment. And that was the human anatomy course. It was the first course in the first year. The first exam, I'd say at least a third of the students were within 5 points of failing the exam, when like welcome to med school. They probably had 5 to 6 times the failure rate as any other course in the first 2 years. And the level of detail and the pressure these students were under was just tremendous, and I'll just say kind of unconscionable. As an associate dean for curriculum, I had no power to change this, but our dean kind of stepped in, kudos to him, and told the faculty, told the course director, you cannot teach this in this way. You need to change, or I'll find a new course director. And so they changed. And what I always say is that they changed from just an extremely toxic course to a moderately toxic course. But that was enough. That was like it wasn't a cakewalk. It wasn't this like wonderful experience for people in terms of the overall, but it's good enough that I think it had a huge positive impact on the first year students. And frankly, the other change we made is, rather than it being the first course as soon as medical students came in, it was the second course, so that students had the opportunity to work with a faculty member, a course director, who was just much more kind and supportive and eased them into the medical school experience. The next few I'm just going to run through very quickly, just because the details don't matter that much. Change to true pass fail in the first 2 years. I don't know how many schools do this. Many, vast majority are now pass fail. But many schools, I still think, use performance in the first 2 years for two things. One is for determination of eligibility for AOA, honor society. And second, they'll often report to residencies where what quartile person landed in terms of the pre-clerkship curriculum, first, second, third, fourth quartile in terms of academic performance. We removed those. And basically then, we reduced all incentives to chase scores, to chase grades. Following, we offered confidential tracking of depression and anxiety, so that those who screened positive could be seen by therapists, no obligation to. And then finally, we did focus supportive second years in the run up to step one, which I think is still a significant stressor, but back in the day was even more so, because it was a scored exam that had a big impact on residency ranking back then. So those were the interventions. I should note here what's interesting about this. We didn't have to blow up the curriculum. We didn't have to change the way we taught tremendously. Yes, there was effort in reducing details and coming up with new schedules, but the overall cost for all of this was less than $3,000 a year. And most of it was just food for meetings. So to me, when I look back at this, I think it's really kind of remarkable to realize how little this kind of intervention cost. So those were the interventions. What were the outcomes? We had 2 baseline classes I reported, and I'm not going to give you all of the data of the intervening years, because it just each year got better and better and better. And then this is the last year that I was at St. Louis University. And see, what you can see is the first year students. I'm just going to say depression rate in terms of ease of conversation. Depression rate dropped from 27% down to 4%. Second year students from 29 to 35% down to 6%. Anxiety, very similar. Anxiety levels dropped from, well, it's dropped at orientation, because I think students were hearing like, hey, it's not bad here. You're gonna have a good time here in medical school. But then the drops in first and second year students was dramatic, with the first years dropping even below baseline, And the second years, um, right before they went into their step one study, where I think anxiety is actually an appropriate reaction, still much lower anxiety rates that they had than the baseline studies. And one thing I sometimes say, I don't know, that I say with a smile on my face is looking at these results. I think it is very possible that you could say for the first time in medical education history that the first year of medical school was therapeutic for their mental health, which is just pretty striking, that they actually had mental health profiles as a class that was better than when they arrived, which is pretty extraordinary, particularly because we still did bad things to them. It was still probably way too demanding, but we did enough to just have a pretty remarkable improvements in mental health and well-being. Um, One other way to look at the data that I have to just mention briefly is, you know, the interventions really could have had an impact on two ways, which is to take those depressed students and anxious students and who were struggling the most and make them feel better. The other approach or the other outcomes could have been that everybody felt better, that there was basically a shift of the entire curve to the left. And what was gratifying to see is that latter is what happened. So you see these blue bars are the ones for depression symptom scores pre-change, the baselines that we talked about. And then the red are ones that was the class of 2018, the most recent class, or the last class that got these changes. And what you can see is the blue bars that are at the top of the range disappeared. Just the really high depression scores just disappeared. But what you also see is the number of students with really low scores for depression jumped dramatically. And what I would say, we didn't have a measure for flourishing at that point, but I think our outcomes were not just that we were helping our students avoid mental illness, that they were actually flourishing. They were actually, many of them were thriving in their studies and in their experience of medical school. So those are the findings that we had. And one of the questions I had at that time, though, is there was a big well-being push that was already starting. And like maybe everybody's getting better as they're working on this well-being thing. But we were lucky enough to have these kind of external benchmarks, which I just want to go through quickly so that you can see, no, this was unique to St. Louis University. So there's a double AMC year two questionnaire. These six domains, the top three higher scores are better. The next three lower scores are better. So what you can see, emotional climate, student-faculty interaction, quality of life, SLU was dramatically better than the national mean on all of those. Perceived stress, disengagement, exhaustion, really dramatic differences in our scores, much better off than the national average. Um, the other thing that was interesting in that AAMC year two questionnaire is they asked students how much sleep they got and how much time they spent in class or studying. And our students reported getting half an hour more of sleep per night and spending an hour and a half less time in class or studying per day compared to the average medical student. So when you think about that, hour and a half per day over weeks and weeks and weeks, these were probably resulted in basically hundreds of hours less spent in class or working to master the kind of material in the pre-clerkship curriculum. And so one of the questions people might ask, well, oh my God, they're not studying as much. They're engaged in all these activities. They're taking care of themselves. They have all this time off. Performance has to drop, right? Performance has to drop. There's no way they could perform as well. And that is, I'm sure, is what you're thinking about. And that's maybe the coolest part of this study. Maybe the coolest part of this intervention is no, performance didn't suffer. The most important one, we had our internal metrics, and certainly I think we saw decreases in failure rates in courses, but the marker that everybody cared about then was step one performance, right? That was the big test at the end of the first 2 years. And what we saw is over this period of time, the mean score rose, kind of paralleling an increase that was going on at that time. But I think the thing that interests me most is the failure rate dropped in half. And it was less than half of the national average in a group of students who shouldn't have been performing that well. We weren't Harvard or Penn or Stanford or, et cetera. Um, we didn't admit, a student body with a median MCAT score of 98. We had students who were high risk for failing, and we were outperforming those expectations. And maybe at the end we can talk about, I think that's surprising for some people that you can actually back off and improve performance, but it actually makes sense, partly because we overteach, partly because depression and anxiety are not helpful for learning, nor is sleep deprivation. So we created conditions where students could spend less time studying and learning and actually perform better. So those were the outcomes. And what I want to turn to just briefly then, as I said, I was doing this work before I kind of was aware of or had kind of created this amalgam model. And I just want to return to that model and say, how much did we hit those things? So workload, clearly, right? We decreased the workload of students, not just in class time or the amount of time studying. Um, Students were studying more to chase scores. Now they could make choices. No, I've learned what I want to learn. I've learned enough. I don't have to chase more information because I want to answer it, get a better score on the exam. It didn't matter. Um, Second was rewards, and this is a trickier one. I think this was more intrinsic, that people had more opportunities to feel good about themselves, that their performance in school wasn't just measured by scores on multiple choice exams. It was how much were you engaged with other people in research or service, tutoring, mentoring, etc. Community connection is obvious. I mean, we saw students' relationships with each other strengthen. There was no reason to compete. Cheating disappeared. Cheating was a problem, and it wasn't people trying to avoid failing. It was people trying to get honors instead of near honors. Connection with faculty improved as well, because there was no arguments about, oh, you know that one question on that multiple choice exam, I think the answer was C, not D. Those disappeared, because people were used to be chasing scores and grades. Autonomy was inherent in this. We gave students significant amounts of time to decide what they wanted to engage in. So vitally important. Fairness, I think, was an important one in a kind of an oblique way, which is the grading system felt at times inherently unfair. Obviously you have to have cutoff for honors. And to have, one student who gets a 90 get honors and the one at 89 gets a high pass, or a half a point away from honors, or the same for high pass versus pass, just felt unfair. It felt arbitrary. Values, one of our values, our mission statement was education of the whole person, mind, body, spirit, and heart. Um, in the old curriculum, I don't think we could say that we really were doing that. And so I think we created a place that was consistent with its values. Mastery, students had the opportunity not to just perform well in classes. They also had the opportunity to excel in spheres outside of the classroom, which I think was important. And this last one, I think, vitally important, is again in those engagement in their extracurricular activities, leadership positions, service to others. There was a sense of purpose and meaning that had been really muted previously. So it's kind of nice, as I was, thinking about this model, to say, yeah, it really hit all the notes, I think, in a lot of ways. And ultimately, we created a new culture. We created an entirely different environment, that was, filled with trust and warmth and I don't know, a connection between administration and students that was profound. So last I'm going to talk about in this last segment, and I'm going to try and leave enough time for a little discussion and questions, that I think I'm moving a little bit more slowly today. Sometimes I drift in terms of examples, but I'll try to move through this next segment quickly enough. So culture. I think one of the things in the well-being movement right now is there's a little bit of a tendency sometimes for people to look at leaders and say, you're responsible for my well-being. You're responsible for my satisfaction. Don't look at me. I'm not the source of the problem. It's up to you to create conditions that will in which I can thrive. And I understand that. I think it makes sense in a lot of ways, but as an absolute, I think it's a really dangerous place. We need to understand that we are all co-creators of the culture. I don't care where you are in that hierarchy. You can have an influence, either positive or negative, on culture. And so being mindful about that is important. One of the threats then currently to culture within institutions that I see across the country is what I have described as kind of problematic, but also really understandable mindsets that are easy to develop in response to an environment which is clearly clearly troubled. And no judgment, for people who have these things. I think that, again, they're very understandable. So when I was traveling around the country before the pandemic, this was not, this wasn't all pandemic that suddenly things went sour. I was seeing really pretty much everywhere a sense of negativity, cynicism, pessimism, frustration, particularly on the part of residents and faculty. Maybe less so for medical students, but these were really profound. And then since I picked up my travel, since the pandemic has kind of wound down, is I'm seeing a change, which I'm seeing even like a heightening of just outright anger and resentment that feels different than what existed in before the pandemic. And again, given the troubles and challenges in healthcare, and the inequities that may occur and the mistreatment and microaggressions, et cetera, understandable to feel this way. But the question I have for people is like, do you want to live like this? I don't think anybody wants to live in this space. So I think we're challenged not to eliminate these feelings. It's fine to feel these, but to not kind of dominate our persona and dominate our experience. And I turn to a quote from Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist, neurologist, writer, philosopher, and notably concentration camp survivor, author of the book Man's Search for Meaning. A quote he said, which I think is an important one, is everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And so in these difficult times, while it shouldn't be seen as accepting or condoning the conditions, I think that all of us are challenged to say, what are the attitudes we're going to have in these circumstances? How can we be a force for light in the midst of the darkness? I think that's a challenge that all of us face, not just in healthcare, but in life today as we face so many challenges. So I'm going to end then with some individual tools that I think can help with these mindsets and potentially improve culture. And again, by offering these, I don't intend to be prescriptive. Oh, you should do this, et cetera. But I think what each individual can do is say, are there tools that you can engage in that will help you be a more positive force, that will allow you to engage with others in a way that makes them feel better, and also, ultimately help you feel better as well. And again, it isn't about being content with when there are inequities or changes that are needed. But as we work on those changes, are those things that we can do ourselves to help create a more positive environment in the clinical learning environment. So a handful of these I'm going to run through pretty quickly. So one is combating negativity bias. So negativity biases, we are all hardwired to have this, which is that negative events will have a more of an impact and a longer lasting impact than positive ones. And it's the experience of going home at the end of the day. You could have had a great day, things going really well, and then you had just one negative interaction, maybe a difficult conversation with a family or somebody who criticized you or was nasty to you, a mistake you made, a lab you forgot to check, any number one thing of those things. And what the tendency is, when you go home at the end of the day, what are you thinking about? It's often that negative thing. And so, what can you do about that? One, just awareness that we are all susceptible to this. Every one of us is susceptible to this. And then one strategy is, okay, not to feel good about the negative thing, but how about running through all the positive things that I did or happened to me today, and to try to put it into perspective. If that doesn't work when you get home, try to get engaged with something that's a distraction, because the more space you have from that negative event, the softer it's going to feel, the weaker it's going to feel. So, being aware of negativity bias, I think, is something that can be really helpful. Second is promoting optimism. This is something that's kind of fascinated me in recent years. It's something called explanatory style. And it's kind of optimism versus pessimism. How do you view yourself and kind of your place and interaction with the world? And it used to be thought that this was like a character trait and it was fixed. And we even talk about it in that way. Oh, that she's such an optimist, or oh, that person, he's such a pessimist. And it's not true. It's not fixed. It can change. And if you want, if you're a somewhat pessimistic person, you can actually work to become more optimistic. But what worries me right now is the opposite is true, is that culture, environment can pull you in a direction as well. So if you're an optimistic person working in a pessimistic environment, you will be pulled into pessimism. It is almost impossible to
Excuse me.
avoid. So the question is, what can we do about this? And I think a really important intervention that I would encourage you to engage in is to really think about what are the natures of conversations you have when you get together with peers or you talk to your family about how work was. I think there's a tendency, especially with residents, but I think this happens with faculty too, is when you get a group of residents together, and by a group, I say two or more, where does the conversation usually go? And it often goes to like, oh, I had the worst call night. This family's going to drive me crazy. This nurse is impossible, et cetera, right? And that's fine. You need to vent. Don't eliminate that. But if those are the only stories we're telling each other, what kind of culture are we creating? What kind of atmosphere are we creating? And so I think this idea of appreciative inquiry, where you don't just talk about the negative stuff, but you also focus in on like what's good. And because it's all there, it's all around you every day. Being in the healthcare setting, there are incredible stories of grace and beauty and self-efficacy and courage and humor. So tell those stories too. Go ahead and vent. Don't stop that. But try to add in those stories, because those are things that can I think fulfill you and make you feel better. Cultivating positive emotions. This is a tool that I haven't used because it's just one where I'm a pretty positive person. But if you're struggling with that, a tool that's pretty well described and evidence-based is three good things, which is if you have a just journal at the side of your bed, just whenever you can remember, even on really bad days, write three good things that happen. And for clinicians, it may be big things like you made a difficult diagnosis, or you had a tough conversation with family that thought went really well, or you accomplished some procedure, or it can be something small. It should be something small. And the example I always use, just because it makes me smile, is that like it could be like the burrito at lunch I had at lunch was just spectacular. So notice those little things because they're around you every day. Um, Managing emotions, I think I'm going to skip over because it takes a little more time. If you want to, if we can talk about it at the end, if in the question and answer period. But I just realized when I was at UCLA, I was completely burned out, and what I realized is that the way I put it is work got my better self. So I needed to develop an ability to manage my emotions in more positive ways, especially for my family, my spouse, and my kids. And again, it just takes a little longer, so I think I'm going to skip that one for now. Generosity and gratitude, there are all sorts of approaches, and some people make it a ritual and a kind of a practice. To me, that's not what I tend to do, and I'm not dismissing it as an approach. You got to figure out what works for you. But for me, I think it's about trying to have an orientation towards that, not just being part of your, you know, orientation to engagement with others is take delight in others, be generous with others, express gratitude, thank people for things. And my sense is the more you do that, the more it comes back to you. So think about ways that you can make that part of your daily life. Um, Managing one's self-critical voice. I have a whole talk on that, the things like maladaptive perfectionism, performance as identity. There are some simple tools that people can use, and I'll just point you to ACGME website called Learn at ACGME. There's a video workshop that goes through these, and then also a series of podcasts. If you go to any podcast platform and search ACGME Aware, there's a series of podcasts about teaching basically how to identify these mindsets, but then also then tools to allow you to kind of think differently, to be able to examine your thoughts and to recognize when they're inaccurate and how you can create a more accurate and kind of personally supportive narrative about your own life and your own performance. And then the last one is finding meaning, and this is the one that I'll end with, which is I just think so profoundly important. And I'll return to Viktor Frankl, as I said, the Holocaust concentration camp survivor. So many quotes I could use, but I'm going to end with this one. And he said the following: "There's nothing in the world, I venture to say, that would so effectively help one to survive even the worst conditions as the knowledge that there's a meaning in one's life. There's much wisdom in the words of Nietzsche. He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." So unlike the concentration camps, unlike in Nazi Germany, we have an opportunity, and I'd say a moral obligation, to change the how. But as we work to change the how, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to kind of discover that why, if you've lost it, to find that why, to feel that way, why, and ultimately be sustained by that. And if we get to that place, I think we're well on our direction to kind of achieving a better state of well-being in healthcare and in medicine. So with that, I will close. Thank you all for listening. I will stop sharing so that I can see folks and go to a view. Yeah, and open it up to questions. So it looks like we have like 6 minutes to go. So we'd love to hear from folks. I see David has raised his hand. David, good to see you. And
Good to see you, Stuart.
yeah,
How are you?
good.
So
Pleasure to see you.
I know you don't like this word, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think you have done a masterful job of addressing this very complicated topic. So thank you so much for your presentation.
I appreciate it.
My question really has to do with measurement. You indicated that when you were at the medical school there, you did some measurement trying to determine what the state of anxiety, depression, et cetera, was amongst the students there. Have you encountered any resistance to the idea of measuring that? In other words, occasionally you'll hear somebody say, well, gosh, if we measure it and then we find that there's a problem, then that obligates us to do something about it. So it's kind of a head in your sand kind of approach. And then the other thing I know that you're aware of is there have been some very strong attempts to legislate some aspects of this. So, states to mandate some type of measurement. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, really important topic or question, and a tricky one. We met no resistance from our students in measurements, and there were a couple reasons why. It's interesting, our approach. I'll try to be quick on this, but one is with our IRB. This was all IRB approved. Second, it was always anonymous until we gave them the opportunity to make it confidential. So it was anonymous. We actually got approval from our IRB to require it of our students, which was interesting because we said these mental health outcomes we think are as important as board scores, graduation rates, et cetera. And so while we did it in class, we didn't send it out. So we had dedicated class time in my classes to where students would fill it out. And we were able to kind of say why we cared and to make sure they knew it was anonymous. Right. So those were features where we didn't get pushback from the students at all. And they knew we were using it to improve the curriculum. Right. This wasn't just a research project. This was the primary focus is how can we do better? So that was one feature. Yeah, I find it really interesting. I think there's huge reluctance to measure depression and anxiety in medical schools still. I don't know. I find it troublesome too that unlike residency, We have no idea how many students are dying by suicide. From what I understand, there is no reporting requirement by medical schools when there are deaths of students, which is not true. ACGME asks every residency program to account at the end of the year what happened with those students. So I think there is discomfort. And I wish it would change, because I think only if a sense of what the problem is can you really start making it interventions. So tough issue, David, but I'd love to see people really move in that direction. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. What other questions or comments do you all have for Dr. Slavin while we have him here? It's a wonderful resource.
Yeah, my name is Amanda Murkison. I'm actually a residency program director. I was just wondering if you have any data. I'm guessing you don't, but do you know if what you did in the medical school was somewhat sustainable through residency? I feel like the residents come in on a pretty positive note, and it takes about 5 to 9 months before I suspect over 50% of them are clinically depressed.
Yeah.
So just wondering if what you do early on even if we don't change anything in residency, which obviously there needs to be changes,
Yes.
is that somewhat sustainable?
Yeah, no, great question. And I wish we had longitudinal studies. The only thing I can say, which is completely anecdote, is I get to travel all over the country and give talks, and there's St. Louis U grads all over the country. And almost always students come up to me and said, "Oh my God, like you made such a difference. St. Louis, you made such a difference that I carry it forward." And so I think you can, though it's not enough, right? We need to continue to strengthen that environment. The other thing that I would say that's really important, and is part of the work, ACGME gave me 15% time to work on adolescent and young adult mental health. Medical students are not escaping this mental health crisis of our young. And I think there's this idea that medical students start medical school with mental health better than or equal to their peers, and it's just us that's doing this to them. No, they have profound vulnerabilities, and I don't blame them. It's not their fault. And the research I'm doing actually is interesting, isn't showing that social media is the problem. In many communities, it's school demands and academic pressure that's causing their distress. These kids are working ridiculous hours on homework and studying and extracurricular activities. So they're coming in often with these mindsets of maladaptive perfectionism, imposter. And while residents, looking at Sreejan Sen's studies, about 4%, 5%, maybe 6% will screen positive for depression at orientation. We need to remember those depression scales. Ask, how have you felt the last 2 weeks? How do you think they felt? They graduated from med school. They're starting residency. If you ask that same cohort of students or residents at orientation, whether you've had a history of depression, 54% have had a history of depression. So there is vulnerability that residents face that we can't blame them. It's not that they're weak, they're products of their system. It's not psychopathology, character weakness, something they did. But the education system before residency is causing them distress. And then they're coming to residency again with maladaptive perfectionism, where it's easy to feel like I'm not smart enough, I'm not good enough, and really struggle in addition to all of things like duty hours, et cetera, and the challenges of medical practice. So there's big stuff there that, I mean, we could spend an hour just unpacking. I probably went too long on that answer, but it's a huge issue and really huge. So thank you for bringing that up.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Slavin. This has been wonderful, even better than yesterday, actually.
Yeah, I think so, wasn't it? I think the second
I think
time
so.
was a
Yesterday was
charm.
great
So
too.
yeah,
I do
thank you.
think one of the most important points that you made is that we are all co-creators in
Yeah,
this. And I see that. You see our audience. We had the dean here yesterday, multiple members from our dean suite, program directors, clerkship directors, but we also have faculty at all points on the continuum
yeah,
here and ready to make a difference. So
right.
I think that says a lot for us and what we're doing to enhance the well-being of ourselves and our learners. So thank you so much for being here and encouraging us to do so with some practical tips on how we might take some next steps. So thank you all. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Think of something really good. I love that encouraging positivity. When you hear grumblings, even if you're feeling them inside yourself, maybe point out something really good about a recent encounter. What, like, wow, that diagnostic catch you made earlier today was outstanding. Something along those lines, I think, are little things we can do to encourage that positive thinking. That's a little step in the right direction.
Absolutely.
Thank you all
And
so
Sherry,
much.
just thank you to you and your team. It's been a pleasure working with you all. And again, thank you for attending today. Really appreciate you spending time with me. So yeah, take care of all and good luck with your work. We'll see you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. Bye-bye.
See you all.